Good day, everyone, and welcome to our March Conscious Leadership Conversation. These conversations are organized by the Leadership Forum community, which is a nonprofit 501c3 focused on expanding conscious leadership. You can learn more about the organization or find ways to get involved by visiting our website at leadershipforumcommunity.org or by inquiring within the chat. My name is Matthew. I'm an officer of the community. And today I am pleased to introduce our provocateur, Lyndon Rego, in our topic of discussion today, the basics for conscious leadership. Lyndon's very involved in our community and has done great work in his own community with his nonprofit, Cometa. I encourage you to look more into what the work that Lyndon does, and I look forward to hearing what Lyndon has to share today. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Lyndon.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Really delighted to be here and see a lot of old friends and some new faces. So welcome, everybody. We're largely going to have an interactive session, but I've got a little bit of information and a setup and frameworks to share with you to get us going into the conversation. But today's focus is really about this notion of conscious leadership and how we can cultivate this in our lives. So the Leadership Forum community, and by the way, could you see my slides advance? Everything working all right? Yeah, okay. So the Leadership Forum has claimed as its purpose this notion of expanding conscious leadership. And the Leadership Forum's been around a long time, and it's been in the leadership field, but there are lots of leadership organizations, and we wanted to call out what was distinctive about who we are and what we're about. And so this vision really says we imagine a world where leadership is empowered in everyone, everywhere, so that we all have the opportunity and tools to exercise conscious leadership in organizations, communities, and societies. And our mission there is to convene. So we bring people together as we're doing right now to explore leadership challenges, develop conscious leadership, and create solutions that result in meaningful and equitable change in organizations, education, and society. So that's it. But then the question remains as to what is conscious leadership? So we're in, I think, the process of really trying to explore that notion, and we'd like to do it with the community. But we thought we needed to have a starting point. So at the upcoming summit that we have happening in July, I believe, we will be kind of focusing on this issue of conscious leadership, but in much more of an exploratory way. But where we've landed on as a starting point is to say that it's really about three critical elements. The first one is around awareness. How do we deepen awareness? Because in order to be conscious, we need to be aware. And how do we clarify intention to know what is it that we'd like to put out into the world? What do we stand for, right? And this is something that extends from awareness. And finally, if we have some intentions, how do we put them into action? How do we represent with our own work and our own actions the things that we stand for, right? So I'd like to maybe use the chat now to ask you to say, well, if we've got this issue or this need to think about how we might deepen awareness, what are ways that come to mind for how we might increase our level of awareness and deepen it? So just put some thoughts into the chat here. How would we deepen awareness? See some good input coming in. Give you all a few more seconds to get your thoughts in. So to read out some of these that we can see here. Ask more questions. Be curious. Pause and reflect. Empathy is key, right? So moving beyond our own kind of internal awareness. Expand your network of leaders to find new ideas, seek others' perspectives, assessments, a more formal kind of technique of getting some feedback that somebody's called out, becoming more aware of unconscious thought patterns, self-reflection, solitude, deep dialogue, feedback, examination of intra and inter communications and our presence. Great. Learning about the challenges we're facing, and relationships to the topics. We all have a pretty good understanding that there are many ways that we can act to deepen our level of awareness. How about that second characteristic of clarifying intention? What might we do to clarify our intentions? to put those in chat.
Lyndon, would it be okay if you tell us a little bit more about intention, what you mean by that?
Yeah, so it represents the things that we stand for. Perhaps it's an expression of our values. It's an expression of what it is that we want from the future. So if we think about the intentions that we have, the things that we want, how might we get better at clarifying what those are? Because there are many, many possibilities for us.
Thank you.
See a couple of comments coming in. Maybe this is a slightly more challenging question. Great. So see them coming in. So I'll just read out some of the things that are coming in. So be more intentional, be clear about our purpose so that we can show up intentionally, understand our purpose and motivations, think long-term. So of course, Greg does a lot of work in this area. Think about the challenges that we're facing and relationships to the topic. So oftentimes what we want to do is related to the things that we want to change, which are often a challenge. Yeah. Consolidate thoughts about the world and new directions to taking that wider view. Be clear in our communications to colleagues and collaborators, right? So intentions are not only what we hold within, but they're the things that we express, right? Which relates to actions as well. Clarify our point of view, ask ourselves what's our motivation, truly seek to understand the underlying context, motivations and goals, thinking about consequences. So a lot there, right? That is really an extension of the awareness that we bring to these choices. Reflect on the contribution we want to make, really important, right? That's about the impact that we want to create in the world. And again, coming back to access a deeper awareness so we can clarify, right? So these things really nest together. And Joel writes about making them public, right? So that these are visible. Again, much more in the manifestation of action, right? So we really want to think about these things, and we'll have an opportunity today to really put this into practice in some way. But I wanted to also take a pause and say, if we're about cultivating conscious leadership, and the conference end goal, if you will, is to say that we want to put this into the world to kind of create a better world. But a certain kind of question is the why behind it. And I think for many of us, really, it's right about this notion of happiness and well-being, right? Ultimately, if you ask people what they want from life, it connects with these notions. And if we think about happiness, there are probably three critical layers, right? There is about this sense of being at peace with ourselves, or our internal kind of state of well-being and our connection with ourselves. And very importantly, this is what you see a lot in the literature. It's about relationships, right? Relationships with friends, family, colleagues, people in the community, and cultivating caring relationships where these are in the zone of positivity. And finally, it's really living a life, which again references that intention part of it, where we feel like we're living our purpose, we're making an impact. It matters that we live and that we're doing things that we care about and making a difference to our world. So I think we want to hold that in mind and say, well, this is also a critical function of why these notions of conscious leadership are important, that we're actually expressing things that are good in the world, but also creating this collective sense of well-being. So with that in mind, I'd like to come in now to really what we'll be spending our time on today. And about a year or so ago, with the Leadership Forum, through one of the labs that was created out of the summit, we had a group that focused in on this aspect of how do we cultivate community conversations that are conscious, or conscious conversations in our community. And over the course of the year, where we met a number of times, we arrived at the framework that you see here, and I'll unpack this for you, and we'll be using this for our conversations today. So it's really at the starting point of being present. As we know today, we're really distracted with phones and social media, and all of these are short bursts of information, and we're microtasking. So presence is increasingly a rare commodity. It's also about creating inclusion and sharing space, right? So we want to make sure that everybody has a turn to be able to express, and also in order to do this, we need to be also active in listening as we create space for other people really paying attention to what it is that they say. There's another part of this model which is at the center there, which is really about being able to acknowledge what people are saying. And this is something that oftentimes we skip over. We might give people the space to talk, and then we jump into saying, well, let me tell you what I think, and let me tell you about my experience and my perspectives. And in this model, we want to create the space to actually say that we want to acknowledge what we heard you say. And there's a powerful reason for this, but it only reinforces and reflects to people that we've heard them, and we're acknowledging what we say, what we heard them say. It isn't about agreeing, but it's really that space of acknowledgement that's really important. We want to make sure that everybody has a chance to speak. And then as we close this out, we want to really focus on what it is that we've kind of shared or put out there in common. Again, really important, because oftentimes, again, in our conversations and engagement with each other, we tend to focus on what's different. Say, yeah, I hear you, but what about this, this, and this? We focus on difference. I think what we found from the leadership literature, whether it's boundary spanning leadership and other methodologies out there, a critical important step is really to say and name what we have in common and to build on the commonality. Because if we focus on difference, it kind of takes us down this path of kind of conflict and somehow having to resolve these differences. By focusing on commonality, we can get something going, we can start to advance the things that we share, and we build a relationship that allows us to actually take on the things that are more difficult. So this commonality part of it is important. So with that in mind, here's the framing for our conversations together. So in the Northern Hemisphere, and I think probably everybody in this call, including our colleague from Africa, is in the Northern Hemisphere here, and it's springtime, right? And springtime is a time when the seasons are transitioning, but it's also a time when new things come to being. We're coming out of winter. And so I want to use this as a certain kind of metaphor, if you will, for the stories we might tell. So I would invite you to tell one of three short stories about what's going on for you. So the first story could be a threshold story. And by that, I mean, it's a story of maybe looking back of the season that you've come through. Many of us, this age of COVID and all the challenges that we face have gone through a lot of difficulty. And maybe you'd like to take this time to just put out there in the small group that you're in some of your reflections about some of the hardships that you've experienced, the challenges that you've experienced, right? That's a certain kind of story you might tell. Another kind of story, which I've kind of labeled as a springboard story that you could tell, is one that is looking forward. It's one of optimism. You've got a vision for what you're trying to put into the world. You're really excited about it. You've got ideas. It's a chance to share what that looks like for you. And maybe if you're in a third space, it might be the space of regeneration. You're not quite clear, you've been through some things, there's some things that you want, but you're not quite sure what the path is. But it's an opportunity to put out there what's on your mind, what are you pondering, etc. What are the things that you are considering and exploring right now? So pick one of these three stories that you might like to tell. And the format for the conversations, once again, is using this process. So somebody will start out, we'll put you in groups of three, start out sharing their story. The others will have an opportunity to practice that active listening. And remember, because you're going to be called on to reflect what you heard them say, it's a chance to really pay attention and absorb as much of what you're seeing from them, what you're hearing. And then as you hear people speak, there's an opportunity, of course, to share back to them very briefly some of the things that really connected with you. Remember, this is not about sharing your perspectives or your experience. You'll have a chance to do that when you get to speak, but it's really the space of acknowledging what it is that you heard from them. And then the speaker will have a moment just to appreciate, what they received from the others, this gift of attention or the words that they heard back. And then you rotate, and then at the end, you kind of connect some dots across the conversations because there'll be things that'll emerge. And the format here in the breakouts, so Matthew is going to be putting us into breakouts of 3, and we'll have roughly about 30 minutes here for us to spend in these small group conversations. So that breaks down to each person in the group having about 5 minutes to tell one of these spring stories, right? Choose one of them. And Then after you've spoken for about 5 minutes, the other two in your group will have a minute or so, maybe just to reflect back what it is that they heard. Remember, once again, this is not about your perspectives or your experiences, but really playing back some of what you heard. And then there's a minute perhaps for the speaker to reflect back, yet again, offer some words of appreciation or gratitude for the sharing that they've received or the listening that they received, and then you rotate to the next person. And so when you've all had a chance and hopefully haven't run out of time, take about 2-3 minutes, whatever's left in your time, really to then do that connection work to say, well, what emerged in common? What have we gained from listening together, right? So as we close out our time in about 30 minutes, we'll just come back and do a quick debrief. So Matthew's put, thank you, Matthew, into the chat, both the prompts and the process that we'll follow. And unless anyone has some questions, we'll get right into it. We'll go into these breakouts. But any questions from anyone on the format or the questions? Good. All right. So with that, see you in your breakout group. Great. So I think everybody's back, and I hope you've had some really good small group conversations. I know that I had a really powerful conversation with a couple of people that I've known but haven't connected in with a while, and just great to catch up with their lives. So I'd love to just create space maybe for about 5 minutes or 3 minutes that we have before we conclude, just to share what your experience is like. You don't have to talk about the substance of the conversations, but just how the process worked for you and what emerged. What did you get out of this kind of approach? And we'll kind of just do this informally. So if you wish to speak, go ahead and unmute and share.
Positive and hopeful.
Thank you, Charlie. And maybe if I could probe a little bit, what made you hopeful?
Not just because all three of us focused on the brightness of what the future holds for us, but the idea that we need to accept letting go of the past so that we can move forward.
Great. I see some nods all around.
Yeah, stop playing the victim.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I can weigh in too here. I felt that in our conversation really felt shared values, shared purpose, and resonance. And I think that process of kind of listening, reflecting, appreciating, connecting set us up where we could actually find common ground, commonalities, common challenges where we were all struggling or struggling, and also hear each other's hope and ideas. And so it was wonderful to hear and to be heard. It felt like a little community was building, and so I felt this hunger for more connection like that.
Thank you, Greg.
In our group, we found a lot of connection in terms of common human experience, that although we were talking about different stories, it all fed into a common human experience, and how important it is to kind of remember that with that connection with the people we engage with.
Yeah, really important point, and that I think that no matter who we were put in with, and we were put in randomly, these things emerge because we're human beings and we're on this kind of common human journey, and sometimes good for that to surface and for us to recognize the humanity in each other. Yeah.
Yeah, just to build
Great.
on Greg, and the same thing happened in our group. I was with Sue, Rose, and Alexander, and we all had very different stories. We picked different ones too from the 3 options. At the same time, we felt like we were able to draw connections. And what was most powerful too was not only we listened to each other and appreciated our stories, our unique stories, but we actually supported each other along the way. And that was super powerful. And I think that goes back to how this is really important for us to be able to connect and just listen, and you know, it all of a sudden it turns into from curiosity to actually compassion and support for one another, which is what the world really needs from all of us.
Mm. Great, thank you, Poi. And maybe one more share if anybody'd be willing to speak about their experience, and then we'll kind of close it out here.
Lyndon, I'll just say that your inspiration was in our room because we really felt the I see you and that sawubona, that spirit, because I felt seen. And I think that spirit just emanated the whole time through our breakout time.
Thank you for that, Sue. And maybe I'll close out then just saying, coming back to that concept, that sawubona, which is how people say hello in South Africa, but it translates into I see you. And David Brooks, who some of you might know, a columnist, writer, said that a lot of the problems in the world actually stem from people not feeling being seen. And as we think about conscious connection and conversation, so much of what we do is interact with each other, and how we show up with this level of presence, with deep listening, with acknowledgement of others, impacts our relationship. And that comes back to these notions of happiness and a conscious kind of living here. So with that, I just thank you for showing up today and engaging in this process, and happy to see all the smiling faces around. There is another model for dialogue and conversation that Sue Rose and the team have developed that you'll get to experience, I think, at the summit coming up if you haven't already. So stay tuned for that. It's an important aspect of what this community is about. So I think back to you, Matthew, to close us out and maybe share some thoughts about what's coming up.
Yeah, no, thank you, Lyndon. That was great. I'm sure everybody enjoyed. It sounded like everybody enjoyed their breakout session. And we hope that everyone got some good takeaways that they can apply in their leadership journey going forward as well. So if you enjoyed this session and are not on the email list, feel free to message me or anyone on this call, virtually anyone on this call, but me, Joel, and even Lyndon and several others would be more than happy to connect you to make sure you're aware of our upcoming events coming up for other ILCs and subsequent ones after. A big one to be aware of is our annual summit coming up this year in July, on July 11th. And I will actually paste the registration link in chat just for anybody that's hasn't registered. I highly suggest it. It's a great time. Tons and tons of just good times, good conversations. A lot of growth happens up that way. You'll learn a lot of great information. We have some great speakers planning to speak at the summit. So highly encourage you to join us this summer. And feel free to keep the conversation going with whoever you may have connected with during this session. So thank you again. We'll keep the line open for a few minutes if anyone wants to chime in with questions or comments. But until next time, everyone, take care.